In Shulchan Aruch, it's gepaskened based on the Gemara that if someone sees a chaver after Yud Beis Chodesh, then he makes the bracha Baruch Mechaya HaMesim. And the reason for that is because if he's gone through Yud Beis Chodesh, then he has gone through a Gzar Din of Rosh Hashanah, and he was Nechtam L'chaim. The Mele the din is that one says Baruch Mechaya HaMesim. So I heard from a Goyin Echad to ask the following shaila, that if you see someone you didn't see from before Rosh Hashanah to after Rosh Hashanah and he's still b'chaim, you should make the same bracha. So if jeder eine kann mir sagen a bracha von Baruch Mechaya HaMesim, we should be zeichet to ksiva v'chasim otayva. We'll try to be Isaac v'siyata d'shmaya today, and the limud today should be the refuah shalema of a Yeled Yehuda Tzvi ben Sar Mir Yasha, one of the grandchildren of one of the Gedolei Rosh Yeshivas here in Lakewood, who's Sheikh of Eretz Tavoy and Zakat Rech Mishamayim Merubim. We'll be Isaac in the sugya of Kedusha Shvius as it applies to Lulav possibly and to Hadassim. The reason why we'll be Isaac in those two minim is because Al Pidina de Gemara, and it's Mefurish in the Mishnah like that even, an Esrog certainly has Kedusha Shvius. Whether or not a Lulav is subject to Kedusha Shvius or a Hadas is subject to Kedusha Shvius is much less clear in the Sugya, and Be'ez Hashem, we will try B'siyata D'Shmaya to set out the basic Nidoinim in that Sugya. The Sugya begins with a Mishnah in Sukkah and Daf Lamed Tes. The Mishnah in Sukkah and Daf Lamed Tes is describing how one buys an esrog which is kadosh b'kedusha shvius. There's a halacha that one cannot be moiser d'mei shvius la'am ha'aretz, which means ordinarily shvius has a unique halacha which is shared only by kodshim and avodah zara, that shvius is tifeses domeha, which means if you exchange one object for another object in shvius, or huadin, where we paskin, if you exchange money for an object, meaning you make a sale, if the object had kedusha shvius, then what it's exchanged for has the kedusha shvius of the object. So, for example, if they're peiros that have kedusha shvius and someone pays money for the peiros, then the domim that he gives for the peiros have kedusha shvius. So, therefore, if the moicher of the esrog is an amaretz, there's a din of ein moisrim d'mei shvius la'amaretz, which means, and there's a machlokes rishonim what we're choishish for, but we don't want mo'is, money that's kodesh b'kedusha shvius, to be in the hands of an amaretz. So if the amaretz is selling the esrog, Chazal were concerned that the mo'is that the seller is giving him, who's a chaver, will then mean that since the esrog is kodesh b'kedusha shvius, the money given in exchange is kodesh b'kedusha shvius, and the amaretz will then be in possession of money that has kedusha shvius, which is what he receives for the sale of the esrog. So therefore, there is an eitzah in the Mishnah which is called havlah, which is in the lashon of the Mishnah, halokeach lulav mechaveri b'shvius. If someone is buying a set of arba minim from his friends on shvius, doesn't mean the lulav specifically. Noisin le'esrog b'matana. He tells the amaretz, I will pay you a higher price for the lulav and throw in the esrog. So because the mekach, the sale, is being transacted on the lulav, and the esrog is not part of the transaction, so therefore the esrog which has kedusha shvius will not transfer its kedusha to the mois. Now, but the Mishnah is clearly making the assumption that the lulav does not have kedusha shvius, because the lulav is what the sale is being transacted for, and therefore the mo'is will not be kodesh b'kedusha shvius. So we have a Mishnah Mefureshes that the eitzah of havloah incorporates a lulav which doesn't have kedusha shvius. That's the eitzah. So this is, we have to just to reiterate the lashon of the Mishnah. Halokeach lulav mechavere b'shvius, and in this case the chaver means an amaretz. Rashi and Tosfos discuss that. Noisin lo esrog b'matana. He tells the seller, give me the esrog as a gift. Because we don't want the transaction to apply to the esrog, we want it to apply to the lulav. Now, the Gemara on Daf Lamed Tes Amud Beis asks the shaila, And the Gemara says, how is there a situation where the esrog is Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius, but the lulav isn't? If we're speaking about a situation where the esrog is Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius, then why isn't the lulav Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius? So the Gemara says, Ihochi lulav nami, zot the Gemara, lulav bar shishis hanichnas l'shviusu. It was a lulav that already grew or budded, had chanota. It began to grow the previous year, and therefore the lulav isn't Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius. And the Gemara then goes on to have a shakla b'taria why the esrog is Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius. And the Gemara says, because the esrog is Kodesh dependent on when it's picked from the tree. And therefore the esrog we're speaking about was picked after Rosh Hashanah of Shemitah. But the lulav goes according to when it began to grow, and that was in the Shishis. So according to the Gemara, the case we're talking about is a year ago, not now, a year ago. Last Ben Kesel Osar, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur last year, where the lulav already started to bud on the tree during Shishis, so that doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. The esrog was picked after Rosh Hashanah, so the esrog has Kedusha Shvius. Zot the Mishnah, if we want to avoid the sale being transacted over the esrog, so let the sale be transacted over the lulav, which doesn't have Kedusha Shvius, and the esrog will be given b'havlah. That's the point which the Gemara now reaches to explain the Mishnah. Now, kum dechais, this year, which is Shvius going into Shminis. So now, if the esrog would be picked after Rosh Hashanah, it doesn't have Kedusha Shvius. But the lulav is going to have Kedusha Shvius, because the lulav grew on the tree during Shvius. So if we were going from the Shvius into the Shminis like this year, it would be the exact opposite. So therefore, to be clear, the Mishnah is speaking about the beginning of Shvius, where the esrog was picked after Rosh Hashanah, so it's Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius. The lulav, which already budded on the tree during Shishis, is not Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius. So Kipshuta, it's mavur in the Gemara that a lulav has Kedusha Shvius, depending on when it began to grow on the tree. If it began to go during Shvius, it has Kedusha Shvius, and if it grew only afterwards, it won't, or before. The Gemara then follows up on the Mem Amud Aleph with the Shaila. Frek the Gemara Kasha, Taima, the reason why you had to say that the Mishnah is speaking about a lulav which isn't Kodesh b'Kedusha Shvius, namely, it's a bar shishis hanichnas l'shvius. It's a lulav that began to form on the tree during Shishis and then was nichnas l'shvius. Frek the Gemara hod shvius, if it would have begun to grow during Shemitah, zot the Gemara Kodesh. Frek the Gemara amai eitzim ba'almahu. It's a piece of wood. Ve'eitzim ein bohem kedusha shvius. Eitzim don't have kedusha shvius. Why? Zot the Gemara, and this is the most basic rule in determining whether or not something has kedusha shvius, is that there is a condition that there has to be hana'oson ubiurim shaleh, which means the use that depreciates the object happens concurrent with the benefit derived from the object. Meaning, let's say, for example, someone would take a piece of wood and light it for illumination. So the illumination is provided by the burning wood as the wood burns. So therefore, that would be considered hana'asam ubiurim shaveh. And we'll see in the Hemshech of the Gemara whether or not it does have, in fact, that din. But in principle, that would be an example. Whereas, says the Gemara, eitzim which are used lahasaka, which are used as fuel, the way eitzim are used as fuel is first the eitz is set on fire, and when the fire dies down and they're burning coals, they're glowing coals, then the food is cooked on the gecholim. Memele, in that case, it's gecholim after the biur, after the elimination of the object. Memele, says the Gemara, stam eitzim are considered ein hanasam ubiurim shaveh. Rashi's lashon is keloyma shana also ubiurishim is ba'amaroyla boim ke'echad kegoin sicha, smearing with peiros of shvius, or says Rashi shtia,
Rashi in the bottom right,
v'hadlokas haner, or lighting, like we said, lighting a candle. And masha enkin zot Rashi yotzu atze hasoka shana osam achar biurim is because mishenasu gicholim oifim bahem. You only begin to bake after the gecholim.
Show the Rashi's, please.
The wood has already been consumed. So the Gemara shaila is a lulav should be considered like any piece of wood. And a piece of wood, the conventional use of a piece of wood is as firewood. Memela, lulav shouldn't have kedusha shvius. So zok the Gemara al korchach. What we have to say is by lulav, it's hanaosam ubiuram shavet. A lulav, its use is concurrent with its being consumed. Zot Rashi, why? Continuation of the same Rashi. Avalulav ikar hanaosoi lechabed esabais. A lulav is used as a broom, and therefore, as you use the broom, the hairs of the broom, the bristles, begin to deteriorate. So it's hanaosam ubiuram shavet, as I state in Rashi, and this is a mefurish Gemara in Bava Kama. In the sugya, nothing to do with sukkah, in the sugya of shinui kaine. In the sugya of shinui, the Gemara says if someone stole someone's lulav, the Gemara says in Bava Kama daf tzadik vav, if someone stole someone's lulav, and the Gemara says, Haiman de gozel luliva, someone stole someone's lulav, v'ov dinu chufya, and he makes it into a broom, koni, he'll be kaine b'shinui. Why? Mei karu hutzi v'hashta chufya, beforehand it was leaves, and now it's a broom. So in the Gemara, it's mavur. That's what a lulav was used for. So Zod Rashi, a lulav which is used as a broom, is an awesome abiuram sham. Adkan, seemingly the Shakla of the Gemara has now reestablished the assumption that the Gemara made from the beginning that the lulav has to be a lulav of shishis hanichnas l'shvius, because if it wouldn't be, it would be kodesh b'kedusha shvius. How does it conform with the principle that kedusha shvius is dependent on hana osam abiuram shaveh? Because a lulav is used as a broom. Rashi says, "Ikar hana osay lechabed esabayis v'hu shas biura v'kulkula." Now, if we look in the Ran on the Mishnah, we would expect that for the Ran to explain the case of the Mishnah, what lulav is being used behavlah, the Ran says something. The Ran says something which from Riyatos seems to be shver. Says Rashi, it says the Ran, "Aval dmei lulav shori." The proceeds from the sale of the lulav do not have kedusha shvius. Why? Mishum de bas shishis hanichnases lashviusi. Because it's a lulav of shishis. That seems to be the Gemara. This is, so far, the Ran is completely consistent with what we expect the maskana based on the Gemara to be. Then says the Ran, Inami, the lulav, eitzim ninu, lulav is wood. The eitzim ein bohem kedusha shvius. Wood doesn't have kedusha shvius. The obvious pell on the Ran, and this is the kasha of the Maram Choviv in Kapis Tamarim, that there's no such rule that wood doesn't have kedusha shvius. It depends what the use of the wood is. If the use of the wood is for firewood, then in Nachanami, it's not hanasam abirum shava. Like Rashi says, first the wood burns, and then you use the gecholim. But if we find the case of wood which has hanasam abirum shava, then avada has kedusha shvius. So how could the Ran say that a lulav doesn't have kedusha shvius? The makar of the Ran is the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos, where the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos says the same thing. That the case of the Mishnah is that the lulav doesn't have kedusha shvius at all because it's eitz ba'alma. And the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos is brought in the Rav, and frek the kapis tomorrow in the same kasha. It's connected the Gemara. Azoi frek the kapis tomorrow. So to explain the shita of the Ran and the Rambam in Pirush Mishnayos and the Rav, so the kapis tmorim shows a teisvis in Bava Kama daf kuf alef amud beis. Now, to be able to explain this teisvis, we'll just introduce a couple lines further in the Gemara and Sukkah that we just saw. The Gemara asks a kasha, and the Gemara says, how can you tell me that wood doesn't have kedusha shvius? I'll show you a case of wood where its use is hana asam ubiram shavet. What's the case? The Gemara asks, v'ha'ika eitzim demashchan. Now, eitzim demashchan, Rashi says, is something called an eitz shemen. It's a kind of wood where the nature of the wood is that the wood is saturated with oil. It's a natural oil that is formed in the wood. And therefore, the twig could be lit like a firebrand. It could be lit like a torch. Rashi says. So, frek the Gemara, Rashi says. So, frek the Gemara, a burning piece of wood is hana asam abiram shava because you're using the illumination as the wood burns, as if frek the Gemara. On that, Rava says, stam eitzim lahasoka hein oimdim. Ordinary wood is used for hasaka. What's the answer of the Gemara? The question was that we found the case that this is wood that's not used lahasaka. So what's the teretz? So Zog facing Bava Kama of Kufal from the days, that the teretz of the Gemara must be that stam eitzim lasokim oimdim means that even atzei shemen,
Show the
even
Taisus.
eitzim demoshchan, ordinarily even they are used for firewood. The conventional use of even eitz shemen is firewood. Therefore, says Taisus, what the Gemara means to say is a yesod. That whenever we want to determine if something has kedusha shvius or not, is its use hana osam u'biuram shaveh,
Taisus Baba
or is
Kama.
its use non hana osam u'biuram shaveh? I have wood which can be used as firewood, which is ein hana osam u'biuram shaveh, or used for illumination, which is hana osam u'biuram shaveh. How do I determine if this kind of wood has kedusha shvius? Zok Taisus, we look at its majority use. If its stam use is, if its conventional use is for firewood, then any other use, Zok Taisus, is considered insignificant relative to the primary use of the eitz. Memele, Zok Taisus, what the Gemara means to say, stam eitzim lasokim oimdim, means that even eitzim demoshchan, stoma is for HaSukkah. You could use it for a torch. It's bottle klape the eitzim. As I state in Taisus. Now, b'toich dvar of Taisus bavarns, and says, don't tell me a different pshat in the Gemara. What would the pshat be? So Taisus have another suggestion. La'olam, the type of eitzim, which are called eitzim demashchan, la'olam, we could say like this. They're never used as firewood. They're only ever used to light. But, so Taisus, I could say the following svara, that we consider, and Taisus doesn't say why, but we consider all wood as being in one category, b'negeh to kedusha shvius. All wood is the same. Memele, since the majority of species of wood, the majority of wood types are used for firewood, and eitzim demoshchan is only one type out of many wood, which happens to be used for light. Therefore, this kind of wood, even though it's always used for light, is bottle klape all other types of wood. In other words, like this. Taisus' initial pshat is that even eitzim demoshchan themselves, we have to be mechadish, are usually used for firewood, for HaSukkah. Zot Taisus, no, I could say a different pshat. La'olam eitzim demoshchan are not used for HaSukkah. But we considered all eitzim as one mean, and therefore eitzim demoshchan are bottle etzel stam eitzim. Zot Taisus, don't say that pshat. You know why? Zot Taisus, I'll bring you a proof that pshat must be wrong. Why? Because the Gemara is mavur Zok Taisus that a lulav has kedusha shvius. Because the Gemara has to say that we're talking about a lulav of shishis. If you're going to tell me that all wood is the same, so what's it going to help you that you found a kind of wood which is called a lulav that's used for a mitzvah? So what? But most wood is used for HaSukkah. So just like eitzim demashchan, you're telling me is not hana osam u'biuram shaveh, because even though you light it, but it's considered the same as every other kind of wood. So what if you make a broom out of a lulav? It should still be considered the same as every other type of wood. Elomai Zok Taisus, this pshat's wrong. And what do you have to say pshat in the Gemara? That the Gemara is being mechadish, that even eitzim demashchan are used as firewood. So Zot the Kapis Tamarim a cheshbon nifla. He says the Rambam Pirish Mishnah is the Rav, and all the Rishonim who we're going to see assume that there is no kedusha shvius in the lulav. They held that this is the shakla v'tayr of the Gemara. That the Gemara first thought that a lulav has kedusha shvius because it's used as l'chabed the is used as a broom. But now that the Gemara proved from eitzim l'moshchan that even an eitz that's used for light doesn't have kedusha shvius, so now Zok Taisus and Bava Kama have two options. I can either say because eitzim l'moshchan also are used for firewood, or I could say that all eitzim are considered as one. Zokt the Kapis Tamarim, it's such a doichak to say in the Gemara, in Rav's Lashon, because stam eitzim lasokkah him oimdim, so therefore eitzim l'moshchan are also lahasokkah. Why? The pashtus is like the tzad in that Taisus says in Bava Kama, that Taisus doesn't want to say. That what the Gemara means is beautiful. Stam eitzim lasokkah him oimdim means all eitzim are considered as one. Taisus in Bava Kama then says that if you're going to consider all eitzim as one, then a lulav can't have kedusha shvius. Why? Because a lulav also is nechal and eitzim. Memele, what must come out is that the Gemara at this point has been chayzer from its whole assumption. Until now, the Gemara assumed that because you can lose a lulav as a broom, so therefore a lulav is hana osam u'biuram shaveh. So the Kapis Tamarim, that's not what the Gemara says according to the Rambam. Once the Gemara proved from eitzim l'moshchan that klal isn't true, Therefore, all wood is considered one. So a lulav can't have kedusha shvius. Nifla. Ba'oifen zot the kapis tamarim that the Ram first starts with Rashi's pshat in the Gemara. That lulav is used lechabed, and the maskana is like the Rambam that the Gemara was chayzer. So ba'oifen zochinu that we have a mefurish machlekes harishonim. Does or doesn't a lulav have kedusha shvius? What about the Rambam himself in Yad? What's the Rambam's psak?
And the machlekes is whether or not a lulav is usually chabedus abayis.
No, that's not the machlekes. The kapis tamarim is explaining the machlekes is avada lulav is used lechabedus abayis. The machlekes is, do we consider benegeh to kedusha shvius all eitzim as one, like Tes says in Bava Kama, and therefore the tashmish of the lulav, which specifically happens to be mechabedus habayis, is considered insignificant because all eitzim have one din benegeh to kedusha shvius. Now the svara still needs a hesber why we consider all eitzim as one. If we have a chance being able, we'll try and get back to that. But that's the svara of the kapis tamarim, which the eitzim is a mufurish taste in Bava Kama. The Rambam in Hilchas Shmita v'Yovel, we would expect that if the Rambam held the lulav has kedusha shvius, then when the Rambam would pass in the Mishnah that the only way to buy an esrog from an Amoretz is by making the transaction apply to the lulav and be mavliya the esrog, the Rambam should say we're talking about a lulav that doesn't have kedusha shvius. For example, a lulav bashishis that was nichnas shvius. But if you look in the Lashon the Rambam says halokech me Amoretz lulav me Amoretz bashvius noisen le esrog b'matana loy nasan loy mavliya the me esrog b'dmei lulav. Now the Rambam doesn't say what the lulav has to be. Zok the Radvaz, the Rambam holds that a lulav doesn't have kedusha shvius. And Rabbi Kiva Eger on the Gillion of the Rambam says that the Radvaz read the Rambam like the kapis tamarim, that the stimas Rambam is like the Rambam in Pirsha Mishnayis, that there's no kedusha shvius in the lulav. And the Mari Kurka says no, the Rambam wasn't mefarish. But avada the Rambam means, of course, in a case where there's no kedusha shvius in the lulav. So Ledina in Shitas Rambam we have a machloikis between the Radvaz and the Mari Kurkus. What the Rambam held benegeh to kedusha shvius in the lulav. The Mari Kurka says the Rambam holds there is kedusha shvius in the lulav, and the Radvaz says not, and the kapis tamarim says that the Rambam Pirsha Mishnayis Kipshuta is muvur that there is no kedusha shvius in the lulav. So if we were now nochis ledina, we have a broad machlokes harishonim. Shitas Rashi, one side of the Ran, and the pashtus of the Gemara of Tosfos and Bava Kama is that avada lulav has kedusha shvius. Shitas Rambam is a machlokes. So what do we pass? So what we'll try and show is that even if we are choshesh to those Rishonim that hold that there is kedusha shvius in the lulav, bisman hazeh, bismaneinu, we have a number of tzodim lahakel not to consider a lulav as having kedusha shvius b'chlal. And we'll try and briefly go through the ktsara, the ikat tzodim lahakel on the kedusha of a lulav bisman hazeh. The first sad which the Achronim discuss, and that's Be'ikr Tshuva min Chashloima in Tinyana from Shlomo Zalman, and we'll see that the Etzem Svara was already applied even to Esrogim, which is a Chiddush, and that is like this. There is a fundamental Tshuva in Tshuvas Marit, Kadman, where the Marit discusses an unusual Shaila. There were those, it was in those days, the trade in silk was extremely lucrative. And raising what's called a telas meshi, a silkworm, was a very profitable business. It seems that the food which was necessary to feed the telas meshi was a kind of a berry, which was edible, which is Meichel Adam. Now, ordinarily on Shvius, Meichel Adam cannot be given to eat to a behemoth. What's miyuchad l'Meichel Adam has to be given to an Adam. That's exactly Sakosov. So the Marit discusses whether or not the telas meshi, the silkworm, can be fed the berries on Shvius. So Zod the Marit like this: if the berry tree or bush was planted in the first place in order for the berries to be fed to the telas meshi, in that case, says the Marit, because we have a rule of note adaita dahachi, that the intent for which something was originally planted determines what the dovar is going to be oimed for, what its use is going to be. So therefore, if the berry tree, even though the berries are edible and they're usually eaten by humans, but since it was not adaita lahachi, the netia gives it the din of Meichel Behema and therefore could be given to a telas meshi on Shvius. As a paskin the Marit. Now this is a chiddush nifla. that even something which is a Meichel Odom, if it was not Toyadaita, the Meichel Behema, it gives it the din of a Meichel Behema. It's mafkia it from the din of Eichel Odom. So briefly to touch on two examples where we find such a cloud. The first is a Chiddush Vashteit in Rambam in Hilchas Ma'aser Sheni. And this is an important Rambam which Bli Neder will come back to. And that is Benegeh to the dinim of Orla. The Rambam paskins in Hilchas Ma'aser Sheni in the beginning of Perek Yud. The Rambam says that what would be if someone planted a fruit tree as a fence, as a boundary around his garden, a hedge. Someone planted fruit trees as a hedge. So the Rambam says that in that case, it's not chal orla on the payers. Hanoitea ilon meichel, zot the Rambam. V'daito yoleshi siag lagino. It should be a boundary for his garden. Loila peiroisav, and the intention is not to eat the fruit. Hareze potter mina orla. Potter mina orla. This is based on Ateras Kayanim, Gzes HaKosu, that when the din of Netiya la'orla is totally on if it's not at lechol, it's not at leperoisav. If it's not the peroisav, not lechol, there's no din orla on the tree. As this passing in the Rambam in the beginning of Perek Yud Ma'aser Sheni. So that's one example where we see that even though it's a fruit tree, it's an elon of peiros. There's no orla on the peiros because it was not tied to the siag. We also see a Ramban in Avodah Zarah in Mem Aleph Amud Beis in Chidusha Ramban, where the Ramban says that if someone plants Meichel Odom with the intent of being Meichel Behema, it's Potem in a Maisa. Because only Meichel Odom is Chai B'Maisa, not Meichel Behema. And Memel, if you planted it like for Meichel Behema, it's Potem in a Maisa. What? Yeah, we're talking about no, from that's not schayr. I guess the person who's raising the Talas Meshi is using it himself. Tanir, yeah, you're right. We'll have to around that. So we have two also Makaris where we see that Natiyah Daita the Hachi establishes that something which ordinarily would be Omer Lachilas Adam does not have a din of Achilas Adam. And we have the same din directly in Hilchas Shvius. Just to add that Reb Shlomo Zalman in his Ksovim on Shvius, published in Minchas Shlomo from Ksav Yad, shows that Rashi in Bava Kama is also meduyak, that if you plant a tree with the intent of peiros being l'meichel behema, it doesn't have the din of meichel adam. Rashi says what determines the din of the product of this gidol being meichel adam or not. Rashi says mishas yitziroson chayil kedushason. Zot Reb Shlomo Zalman mishas yitziroson means from formation, which means if one intends to use it l'meichel behema before the shas yitzira, meaning when it's planted, it won't be chaladin, that it's omer l'meichel adam. Azoi is Reb Shlomo Zalman medayek from Rashi in Bava Kama. Memele, not hadaita the hachi would be an eitzah, because here, since the lulav trees are planted primarily by commercial growers who are growing them the mitzvah, so therefore, it was not a daita for a use, not as a broom, but for a use of mitzvah, which is not hana asam abiram shaveh. Memele not a daita the hochi would be mafkia the elon from kedusha shvius. This is the essential svara that Reb Shlomo Zalman suggests. Now, the emes is Reb Shlomo Zalman's. I'm sorry. Oh, givaldik. So the etzem svara, and that's an excellent point, and we'll come to that. The achronim already use by an esrog. There was a famous pulmus called Esrogid Korfu, where there was a shmua, which is very questionable with the hindsight of history if the shmua was emes or not. But at one point there was a shmua that Esrogid Korfu, which is where most of the European Yidden got their esrogim from, were murkav. And then the trade of esrogim switched to become supplied by Eretz Yisrael. It's a very well-known pulmus for the pulmus of Esrogid Korfu. So as the Moichrim, which to us this is now...
Where is Corfu exactly?
Corfu is an island in the Mediterranean.
That's not Crete, it's not Crete.
It's Corfu, a separate island. Yeah, it's an island in the Mediterranean. So Memele, which to us is a wonder because all our Dalamina now come from Eretz Yisrael, but in that time, in the 19th century, it was the Paiskim had to deal with the various shaylas involved in sending esrogim from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. And one of the shaylas that came up was that Me'ikar Hadin, Peiros Shvius cannot be sent from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz. Why? but as is mavur in Masechta Shvius, that Paris Eretz Yisrael cannot be sent. Paris Shvius cannot be sent to Chutz La'aretz. So one noise was if the Dvar Mitzvah there's a heter. One of the tzdodim which the Achronim use betziruf, that it's a Dvar Mitzvah, and various other heterim, was first nischadish by the. At that time he was the Rav Dobrava. There's a country who's the father of the Chabina Rav, the Balagud Sezek. He has a kuntris on Pa'as HaShulchan. I'm sorry?
The Dumver. Yeah.
So he has a kuntris. Brother, I'm sorry. He has a kuntris. I apologize. He has a kuntris called Mishmeres Lahabayis, which is written on the Pa'as HaShulchan. And in the tshuva, in the back of the Sefer, he's mitzaded that the same way as we have note adai to the hochi by orla is mafkia the din pri, so really esroigim planted in Eretz Yisrael specifically for use for a mitzvah should not have the din of kedusha shviyas b'chlal. It's mitzaded like that. That's b'dekach.
He was the first person who came up with this svara?
So the emes is he is mitzayin that the svara already is in a friyadek tshuva sefer called tshuva shardeya, where he already is mitzayin.
Not in the Rishonim?
Not in the Rishonim, not as far as we know. Possibly Larisi and Uriah, but as far as we know, the Iketzad was in Schadish in the Chuvas and Chuvah Sharideya. That's his svara. Now, Lemaisa, we're not soymech on that by Esrogim B'chlal. The reason why we're not soymech on that in Esrogim, and the svara to be mechalik, what you were asking, between an Esrog and Lulav, can be explained as follows. We'll be makdim a marganisa. It's pashat oinig yontif to know this maramak. Mamash adavar nifla. There's a Chuvas Marash Dam, Kadmon, who says the following chiddush. We're all familiar with the Mishnah that you cannot be yotze with an esrik shel tev. It's a Mishnah because it doesn't have heter achila. Zok the Marash Dam, the din in Meiser is that something that is harvested not for the purpose of achila doesn't have an isser of tevel, like kotzer l'maychel behema. Zok the Marash Dam, if you cut an esrog, if you harvest the esrog, not for the purpose of achila, but for the purpose of the mitzvah, zok the Marash Dam, being koitzer l'mitzvah is not ktsira la'achila. And therefore, there should be no problem in being yotze with an esrog of tevel, because there is no isser of tevel. It's not kotzer la'achila. The Marash Dam says the whole din of esrog shel tevel means that it was kotzar for achila, and now you want to use the esrog, so it's already chalad in tevel, because it was already niktzah la'achila. But luyutzu it wasn't niktzah la'achila. Zot the Marash Dam, there's no din of, there's no isser. As they state Marash Dam. The halacha today, Bisman Hazeh, we always mafresh trumas and maestros from the esrogim. We don't even leave the ma'aser minei ubei. But the dina, Zot the Marash Dam, there should be no problem in being koitzer an esrog l'shem mitzvah, and it won't have an isser tevel. Not a marganisa or state in Marash Dam. Zot me simcha in Periches Lulav. Zot me simcha. The Marash Dam's din is nistar from a Mefurish Rambam. We had mentioned a halach in Hilchas Arla that if you're noitea an ilon as a fence, as a siag, there's no din Arla. What about if you noitea an esrog tree l'shem mitzvah? Does the payers have Arla or not? Pashto Shaila, every Baal Parvis who plants esrogim to use for dalad minim. It's also not la'achila. So Netel Siag doesn't have Arla, so Netel mitzvah shouldn't have Arla. But the Rambam says Mefurish in Perek Zayin, HaNetel mitzvah kegoyin shenota esrog lululav. He was Netel and esrog to use as part of the dalad minim. Lulav in the lashon of the Tanoi means al shem halulav nikru kol dalad minim. Actually says in a few places. Or says the Rambam Zayis lemenorah. He plants an olive tree in order to use the oil to light the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. Zot the Rambam, Chayiv Ba'arla. Zot der Mei Simcha Weistach Ois being Koitzel Mitzvah is the same as being Koitzel Achila. It's a use. As I state. So Memela the Marash Dam's din that if you're Koitzel Mitzvah, it's not going to be Chayiv and in Afroshas Trumas and Maises, and therefore there won't be an Issa Tevel. It's Pashat Lista from Furush Rambam. The Marashdam said that in the Chanami, when you're koitzel mitzvah, it doesn't have a din of koitzel achila. We prove the din of being neiteya that determines the use of the peiros is clearly mechalik between the mitzvah and the achila. Kushin the flaw of the Ramei Simcha. Now, if one's ma'ayin carefully in Ramei Simcha, the Soich Dvar of Ramei Simcha says that it's possible that the Rambam's din of neiteya esrog lulav still has the din of arla is only because an esrog be'etzem, in terms of what its conventional use is a pri. And therefore, the only thing that will be mafkia, the din pri, will be if you're neiteya l'syag. But something that is not necessarily a pri, but it's the intent of use which will be determined if it's Meichel Odom or not. There it's possible that Notei L'Mitzvah will not be considered equivalent of Notei L'Achila, and therefore it won't have the din of Orla, and therefore won't have the din of Tevel, and therefore by extension won't have the din of Kedusha Shvius. Meaning like this: if the stoma is that it's a pri, then Notei L'Mitzvah will not alter its stoma that it's Omed L'Achila. But where it could be either, then Notei L'Mitzvah is not an intention positively to be Oichel, and therefore it won't be Oichel. In that case, we then have an answer to your shayla. By Esrog, we're not makel to say that Esrog doesn't have Kedusha Shvius, because the Rambam is mafurish that Notei L'Mitzvah by Esrog has Orla. Masha'enkin Lulav, which is Notei L'Mitzvah, because a Lulav isn't Be'etzem and Oichel, its holding Kedusha Shvius depends on its use. So therefore, if one didn't intend to use it as a broom, but intended to use it l'mitzvah, it won't have Kedusha Shvius. This is what would be mavur mitoich Ramei Simcha in Perek Chesed L'Chazluv. So Oibazoi, we now have established Be'ezer Hashem one svara that the lulav bizman hazeh shouldn't have Kedusha Shvius because it's not mitchila adai to the mitzvah. This is the basic svara, which is oila mitoich Reb Shlomo Zalman in Tshuva in Tinyon in Kuf Yud Ches, and more ba'arichas in Reb Shlomo Zalman's Ksavim in Shvius in Perek Ches.
Which means Reb Shlomo Zalman Lamaisa would not have a problem with any Rulavim L'Kedei L'Gab Kedusha Shvius, and he's saying on this svara.
Correct, and we'll come to halacha l'maisa in a moment. The second svara that we find, Reb Chaim brings in Derech Emunah, in Hilchos Shmita v'Yovel, on that halacha of being mavliya the esrog in the lulav, and he brings in the bir halacha that he heard in the name of the Chazon Ish that to bizmanenu there's another very basic reason why we don't have to be machmir to consider like those rishonim that hold that there's Kedusha Shvius in a lulav, because a lulav today is not used as a broom at all. That's not its use. Now, even though Midina de Gemara, that is the use, the Chazon Ish in Shvius, not in connection to Lulav, but in connection to a different din, which we'll come to in a moment, brings rayas that we do not have to follow Ladina, what Chazal established would have been the conventional use of something Bisman Gemara, and it doesn't impact Bisman Hazeh. The Chazon Ish is talking about a very common shayla in Eretz Yisrael. It was Negeh Mamash Chay Yoim Yoim during Shvius. And that is the dinim of what are called garinim and klipos, the pits of fruit, the stones of certain fruit, and the peels. Now, midina of Chazal, those are Meichel Behema, and therefore something that's Oymed LaMeichel Behema has Kedusha Shvius. The Chazon Ish is mitzaded that bismanenu, that garinim and klipos are not given to behemoths, but that behemoths are not motzi beinenu, so therefore we can be makel on garinim and klipos. And the Chazon Ish brings a parallel for the dinim from the dinim in Hilchos Brachas, where we see that the dinim of whether or not something has a din of a pri or a yerek depends on what it's planted for, what its conventional use is. And the Sharatzi and the Mishnah Berurah says that bismanenu, if the mitzias change, that will change the bracha. So Zot the Chazon Ish, we therefore see a klal that what Chazal determined the usual intent of a person is and the usual use of something doesn't determine what the mitzias of Bisman Hazeh. And therefore, there's a tzad to be makel in garinim and klipos. So, memela, by extension, we can use that same klal of the Chazon Ish that the whole din of Kedusha Shvius on a lulav is only because, like Rashi says, Ikar hanoasa lechabed sabayis. Ikar hanoasa is not lechabed sabayis. Ikar hanoasa is the mitzvah. And Mimela there won't be kedushas shvius. As they state in Chazanish. Now, l'chayra, the first heter is possibly more meruvach than the second, because the first heter doesn't rely on changing from the zman chazal. Avada, it could be used possibly bizman hazeh even as a broom. And in Chaim, in Be'aloch's mitzada that he heard, that the Arabs still use lulavim as brooms. But according to Reb Shlomo Zalman's heter, we're not concerned about that because we have the merit that not te'adai to the hachi determines me'ikar adin, like by oral. So we have two possible heter. Ledina, Chaim brings that the Chazanish was machmir for himself. Ledina, he held that one doesn't have to be machmir and kedusha shviyas on the lulav, but la'atzmoi, the Chazanish was machmir. Reb Shlomo Zalman and Reb Elyashiv are both machriya me'ikar adin, that there's no chashash there's no tzad to be machmir, to be noy kedusha shviyas by a lulav. Why is that negel inyonenu? Because what's negel inyonenu is that even if we want to be machmir, to be noy kedusha shviyas in the lulav, and we'll see the nafkaminas in a moment, we started off with the Gemara that there should be a din of ein moisim d'mei shviyas lama aretz, which means when we go to the moicher now, we buy a lulav that grew in Eretz Yisrael, which many of them do now. We should be concerned that the money that we're giving is going to be MITZVAS b'kedusha shviyas of the lulav, and ein moisim d'mei shviyas lama aretz. So that we have a swara that both Rabbi Yasher and Shlomo Zalman say, that the din of ein moisim d'mei shviyas lama aretz is b'mokum that it's clear that it's muskim that it will be d'mei shviyas, but b'mokum that the ikar shitas hapoiskim is that it's not d'mei shviyas, then we don't have to be choshesh to the din of ein moisim d'mei shviyas lama aretz in that case. So therefore, one can be kohen of the lulav without that chashash. So this is the hachra of both the Rebbe Elyashiv and the Chazanish. There is something important to note, and that is that one should try to be medactic. And Rebbe Elyashiv was mefarasim a tshuva about this, which was not just a tshuva written that is now in print in Kibbutz Tshuvas, but was mefarasim b'shaita a number of shmitas ago. That there is a din in shviyas which is called nevad, which means if chas v'sholem work was done on the peiros during shviyas, then there is a machlokes harishonim if that asses the peiros b'diavad. It's actually a machlokes harishonim in that same sugya in sukkah. The Balamora seems to be mavur that nevad has no issa b'diavad, and the Ravid says it can't be less than svichim, and therefore akaponim it's also midrabon. The arachreinim the amitzadded that it might even be a shaila of an issa deraisa, is mavur possibly in Yushalm. Lahalocha by nevad b'diavad wemeka. But Reb Elyashiv was mefarasim that one should certainly be medactic, that even if one isn't going to be this, even though one isn't noya kedusha shviyas in the lulav, but the din of nevad is irrespective of whether or not the pri has kedusha shviyas. Nevad would mean any product that was enhanced based on because of the avodah that was done to it has a nidin whether or not it's also b'diavad. Mimela zot Reb Elyashiv was mefarasim and michtav yahader to ensure that there's not nevad. And in fact, I saw Baruch Hashem this year that many of the excellent lulavim have on them a specific hashgacha that no avodah was done, which is certainly a diktuk that's right to be mahadir.
Lulavim do not need any work on it at all in a general year.
They do need some.
What do they do?
They make sure.
What do they do?
They cut down other lulavim that grow too close. They sometimes shield them from the sun. There's various things that they do in order to enhance the growth of the lulavim. So if you visited an ancestral the Colin farms, you'll see. But there's quite a lot of work that they do. So that even though the Chazanish says that work can be done in order to prevent the loss of the harvest, but many Achronim hold that doesn't mean that only means if you're going to lose the entire harvest. But if it's just going to become possible a mitzvah because of some slight defect, that doesn't allow you to do avodah b'shviyas. The same reason why no avodah can be done on esrogim b'shviyas, even though as a result of the lack of avodah, many of the esrogim become damaged for mitzvah. Yeah. A fascinating shayla. If we would want to be noya kedusha shviyas in a lulav, so we would want to try being mahadir to be noya kedusha shviyas with a lulav. L'chara we can declare a basic shayla which ba'onyi I have to be moida. I have not found a maramokim for until the orchas rabbeinu of the stipler. Can one make a kosherol out of the leaves of a lulav? The Gemara, the Brisa says.
Kosherol.
The Brisa says that the derech was to be oiged the lulav b'minoi. Shirim would be b'gimoini shalzov, be'ikra din it's kasher b'meshicha, but the derech was to be oiged b'minoi. So can we take leaves of a lulav and be oiged them? What's the shaila? The shaila is, Rashi says that if a lulav has kedusha shvius, it's because it's to be used as a broom. So if you tear off the leaves, they can't anymore be used in order to make the broom. So l'chayra, you're being mafsid the perish shvius, changing them from a conventional use to something else. Can you make a kosherol, or sometimes called a kosherol, out of the leaves of shvius? But only I didn't find the Maramakam. It's a brayso mefureshas. That's what the conventional way to be Eiged Lulav was, to be Eiged B'minyan. And Shvius, they didn't do that. What did they do? I found B'siyata D'Shmaya in Orchos Rabbeinu of the Steipler that the Steipler was masupik about this, if you could do it or not. And in each Shvius, he would declare anew. One year he said you could use it to bind the Lulav, but you can't use it to bind the Hadassim and Naravos, various Achrois. I found afterwards, Be'ez Hashem, that Reb Chaim in Bir Halacha Afanor discusses this same shayla. So this is a fascinating shayla. L'maaseh Reb Chaim is machriya lo. It's kedai to see the absolute geoinus of Reb Chaim's raya. It's nifla. Time doesn't allow us to see the raya. The raya is masak midvash. Let me say so. Raya nifla that Reb Chaim brings from a Gemara in Bava Kama b'negei to Shinu. But homias, that's one nafkimina. A second nafkimina will be the din of biur. For those who take an esrog from Eretz Yisrael in Shnas HaShmita, one should be medaktik to send the esrog back to Eretz Yisrael for biur. What about biur of the lulav? Should we send the lulav back to Eretz Yisrael for biur? So Kipshuta, Taisis in SUKKAH Daf Lametesam Ad Aleph says that there's no biur on the lulav. Why? The reason why there's no biur on lulav is because the miskayim, the whole basis of the din of biur is because eventually it's kolo lechayim in asabe. Eventually, like any fruit or vegetable, anything that grows, eventually that is eaten, is consumed. A lulav is always on the tree; it's a branch of the tree, so therefore it's not shaykh the din of biur by a lulav b'chlal. On the other hand, we find that Taisis in Bava Kama Daf Kuf Beis Pele, that Taisis b'Teich Dvarav says that a lulav does have biur, and the Chazon Ish in Shvius asks, how could the lulav have biur? It's miskayim. So the Chazon Ish is machriya lahakol that lulav doesn't have a biur, and that's the askam of other achreinim. Memela by lulav there's no issue of biur. Let's now briefly discuss the sugya of kedusha shvius as it impacts a hodos.
Before the Rav goes off lulavim, so Lamaisa, Balabas goes to buy a lulav this year. So what do you recommend? What did you do? What are you telling your shaylim?
Halacha lemaisa, one should look. Dr. B'Yashiv, one should look lechatchila for a lulav. One should be mehader. He says to look for a lulav that has a reliable hashgacha that there was no nevad. Lemaisa, one can be makel to make a kosher out of the lulav. There's no chayvas biur, and there's no problem of mesiras d'mei ha'aretz, mesiras d'mei shvius.
But what about are the meichrim selling two types of lulavim? One with kedusha shvius and all of that.
There are some meichrim that are selling lulavim from chutz la'aretz. They tend to be of inferior quality, and the majority of lulavim that are usually lulavim from Eretz Yisrael. If one wants to be mahader for lulav from chutz la'aretz, one can, but they're generally of inferior quality. So that's the.
And with Saimachan that no kedusha shvius.
Yeah. The Chatchila one should send them back to Eretz Yisrael for beer. Yes, if one can't, the various problems to be made, but the Chatchila one should send them back to Eretz Yisrael for beer. Yeah. Let's just touch briefly in the time that we have on the shaila of kedusha shvius and a hodos.
You have an esrog from Eretz Yisrael. Who has one this year?
So lepele that we have a sugya arucha, whether or not there's kedusha shvius by a lulav. That's kipshuta a sugya in the Bavli and a machlekes Rishonim have to paskin about a hodos. There is no sugya. You don't have a sugya about a hodos b'chlal if there's kedusha shvius. Let's go back again to the controversy over Esregi Karfu. We spoke about that the gedolim of that door had to anticipate the various shalas lahalacha, sending Esregim from Eretz Yisrael to Chutz La'aretz by shvius. One of the issues that the poskim had to deal with was that the soichrim selling it in Chutz La'aretz were amei haaretz, and people therefore would be moiser d'mei shvius lam haaretz when they would buy the esrog of shvius in Chutz La'aretz that year. So to counter that problem, Bishua Leib wrote the following eitzah. he said that they should export from Eretz Yisrael together with the esrogim hadassim, and they should sell the hadassim together with the esrogim and be mavliya. So the sale should be transacted over the hadas, and the lulav and the esrog should be included in the sale, like by the lulav. In other words, what Rabbi Shua Leib has assumed is that there's no kedusha shvius and hadas, and Rabbi Shua Leib brings no raya to this. But Toich Dvarav, he says yishluchu hadas l'chutzlaretz, but yiknu es hadas v'yavliu es esrog. That's Rabbi Shua Leib's eitzah. L'chayr Rabbi Shua Leib smach is because we find no sugya about it. There's no sugya. Why does the Mishnah have to give the eitzah of using the lulav and not using the hadas? Rabbi Shua Leib doesn't bavar on the shayla. L'chayr, if a hadas doesn't have kedusha shvius, so why be nichnas to the whole issue of lulav shashishish and nechnas shvius or vice versa? Talk about the hadas. The Meiser Rabbi Shua Leib assumes this is brought in Shuvas Tzitz HaKodesh of Rabbi Hirsch Michal, Talmud of Rabbi Shua Leib, that was Rabbi Shua Leib's Hayrah. And Rabbi Hirsch Michal doesn't make an asik out of it b'chlal. Agav, it's kedai to emphasize that we see another point in Rabbi Shua Leib, that Rabbi Shua Leib was machmir b'negea to lulavim. Because if Rabbi Shua Leib held that a lulav didn't have kedusha shvius, so let him just say export lulavim with hetzregim, which is what we do now, and be mavliya together with the lulav. Why the hadas? It's much more difficult to export hadassim than lulavim. Lulavim survive the trip much better than hadassim do. Kanira and the Tzitz HaKodesh is then married to be mefalpul in this, whether or not it does or doesn't have kedusha shvius a lulav. The Meiser Rabbi Shua Leib's hanacha was that it does. On should be choshesh that it does. But Ladina, we already said what we said. But l'chayra, the nidin of whether or not a hadas should have kedusha shvius, kipshutai, is a niboya in the Yerushalmi. We have Mishnayos in the beginning of Perek Zayin of Shvius that says that wood or certain fruits which are used also for smell have kedusha shvius. Ale vered, rose petals, ktaf, various instances where something is primarily used l'reach and it's mavur, it has kedusha shvius. The Yerushalmi then declares in Iboya, if something is only oymed l'reach, what's its din b'negea to kedusha shvius? Dainu, ale vered, and ktaf, and many other tzirim that the Yerushalmi is moine. Even if they're used for reach, but they have other primary uses. But something whose use is only l'reach, what's its din b'negea to kedusha shvius? Unfortunately, time doesn't allow us to explain the Iboya. Why should it have kedusha shvius? Why shouldn't it have kedusha shvius? Al koponim, there's a Iboya in the Yerushalmi. Now, l'choira hadassim, which are primarily used for reach, and they're not really used for anything else. They're used for reach, used for besamim. If they have kedusha shvius, should be tali on Iboya in the Yerushalmi. That's a chora what should be. That's a chora what should be the din. And I found by Ezra Hashem that Reb Chaim in Derech Emunah in Perek Zayin in the Tzion Halacha makes the same assumption that the din of kedusha shvius and hadassim should be tali on Iboya D'Leif Shet in Yerushalmi. And in Mela, since it's in Iboya D'Leif Shet in Yerushalmi, we should be naked l'chumra. There should be kedusha shvius and hadassim. The hepech of, and he's mitzayin to this Rabbi Shua Leib. Hepech of Rabbi Shua Leib. So it's interesting that in Rabbi Elyashiv's own hachra, Rabbi Elyashiv held one should be noita lahachmer if one can by hadassim to be noy kedusha shvius by hadassim, and therefore lechatchila take from yivul nochri of hadassim in shvius. I haven't seen what is available this year in the shuk yet, hadassim wise, but Rabbi Elyashiv writes, he says lechatchila, he writes yikach minochri, lechatchila yikach minochri. Azoi is mevur in the michtav that Rabbi Yasha said, and that was his hachra l'maisa. And the reason is, I'm sorry.
Is that possible with Metzias?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, many of the other groves are owned by Nachrim. So this would be the makom that to be mechalik between a lulav and a hadas. A lulav we had, it's either not used as a machbeda or it's not yadai to the hachi. Masha'in kain, in the case of hadassim are oimel l'reach, and there should be much more of a tzad to be noita that they should have kedusha shvius. It's possible that now some of the premier brands of hadassim are not only adai to the mitzvah, and if it's not adai to the mitzvah, then we have the svar of the Marit and the Shlomo Zalman that not adai to the mitzvah doesn't have kedusha shvius. And therefore, there'd be a mokum to be mavara that some of the premier brands of hadassim may not have an issue of kedusha shvius b'chavas manazeh, and one has to be mavara, with information based on the grower. I have not had a chance to be mavara yet. What's for sale in this?
How could a nachri have a das to create a mitzvah? How could a nachri have a das?
No, we're talking about not nachri. We're talking about not to Yisrael, not to Yisrael, to the mitzvah.
A Yisrael adai to the
Correct,
mitzvah.
Yisrael adai to the
Separate
mitzvah.
heter.
Separate entity. So Ladina, we have the following: Benegeh to be an kedusha shvius and the
Mr.
lulav.
Kama.
The din is that the Chazon Ish was machmir la'atzmoi. Benegeh to hadassim, Yashiv was noita, and his lashon is that lechatchila, if one can, yikach minochri, in order to be chesed to that tzad in the Yerushalmi, that something that is ossi entirely l'reach possibly has kedusha shvius. Just to finish briefly with divrei Agoda, a beer from the Biskirov that was recently misparsim in a sefer called Ma'iris Rabbeinu Meir Halevi from the Ksavim of Rameya, the son of the Biskirov, a beer nifla and tefillah of Yom Neiroim from the Biskirov, which I think was not misparsim previously. In the bracha himtsoyis of the tefillah of Yom HaNeiroim, the chasima of the bracha is Kachenu b'mitzvosecha v'simchalkenu b'seresecha sabeinu mituvecha v'samchenu b'shuasecha v'tayar libeinu la'avdecha be'emes. And we're Messiahim ki ato Elokim emes udvarcha emes v'kayom lo'ad baruch atah Hashem melech al kol haaretz. The Biskirov stells a chanashayla. The Gemara in Pesachim Daf Kuf Daled is mavur that we need me'ein ha'psicha somuch l'chasima. That before the chasimas habracha, one requires that the chasima should reiterate the psicha of the bracha. What's the psicha of the bracha of the tchila of the bracha emtzoyis? The tchila of the bracha emtzoyis is ato b'chatonu mikol ha'amim, ahavto isanu yom trua, and the psicha of the end of the bracha is Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu meloichal kol ha'olam kula b'chaydecha. So l'chayra minimally, the chasima of the bracha should be chayzer on the inyan of Malchus. The chasima begins with Elokeinu v'Elokei Aviseinu meloichal kol ha'olam kula b'chaydecha. So the basayf we should reiterate Malchus like wechaysem melech al kol haaretz mekadosh Yisrael v'yem hazikaron. So somuch lechasima there should be a mention of Malchus, but that's not what it says. It says ki ato Elokim emes udvarcha emes v'kayim lo'ad. How is that me'ein chasima? How is that me'ein psicha somuch lechasima? It's neither shaykh to the beginning of the bracha of Yom Tov, and nor is it shaykh to Malchus, which is the beginning of the chasima. This was the kasha that the Biskirov. It's clearly a direct continuation from Tar Lebeinu La'avdecha Be'emes Ki Ato Elokim Emes. But this is the chasima sabracha. The chasima sabracha should mention either Malchus or the Yom Tov. The Biskirov shtelz. So to answer this, the Biskirov makes reference to a yisoid that the Nefesh HaChaim speaks about in Shar Gimel, and the similar yisoid is in Shar HaYichud Ve'emunah from the Balatanya. They say kimat the same yisoid on the pasuk of La'olam Harcha Hashem Nitzov Bashamayim. That the Dvar Hashem La'olam is Nitzov Bashamayim. Both types. The Olam was Nivra Ba'asara Ma'amoros. The fact that the Olam was Nivra Ba'asara Ma'amoros wasn't a one-time event that the Maimor brought it into Bria. Baruch Oimer Va'oiseh. The same way as we have a klal that the Bria is kaseder being nivra b'kol rega v'rega yoitzer or uvoyrei choshech. The oifen in which the oilam is kaseder nivra b'kol rega v'rega is because the asar ma'amoros of the Dvar Hashem are constantly being reiterated. Lo oilam Hashem dvarcha mitzvah b'shamayim. The Dvar Hashem that created the oilam it's constantly being reiterated. As I say in Nefesh HaChaim and Shar Gimel, and similarly you saw it in the Balatanya in Shar Yichud Ve'emunah. Lo oilam dvarcha Hashem mitzvah b'shamayim. Zot the Biskirov, Rashi, on the pasuk by Avram and Melchizedek, Hashem is called the Koinei Shamayim Ba'aretz. We say it in the bracha of Me'in Sheva, Leil Shabbos, Koinei Shamayim Ba'aretz. The Rebbeinu Shalom in Birchas Obis is called the Koinei HaKoil. Rashi says that how is the Rebbeinu Shalom, so to speak, the Koinei HaKoil, the Bailim? Because the Rebbeinu Shalom was Boirei HaKoil. Lashon Koinei means also the Lashon Boirei. Zok the Biskirov, Al Korchoch, therefore, the Malchus of the Rebbeinu Shalom on the Bria isn't just established because the Rebbeinu Shalom was once the Boirei. The Rebbeinu Shalom's Malchus on the Bria is because the Rebbeinu Shalom, the Korega V'Rega, has been mechadish the Bria from Epis V'Toyu. Koinei HaKoil Loshen Hoive. Harimoisi Yodi Lekel Elen. Koinei B'Hoive. Shamayim Ba'aretz. Koinei HaKoil. Memele, the oifen in which he established Malchus at the Biskirov Nifla, Ki Ato Elikim Emes, Udevarcha Emes V'Kayim La'ad. The Dvar Hashem that's Mekayim, the Bria, the Chorega V'Rega is Kayim La'ad. The Chorega V'Rega, the Dvar Hashem is being Mekayim Shamayim, La'orcha Hashem Dorcha MITZVAS Shamayim. Memele, that is the Machriach of the Rebbeinu Shalom's Kinyan on the Bria. And Memele, that's why being Choizer, to Ki'ato Likim Emes, which the Rambam in the beginning of HaChassidus that says Emes means it's Kaim and is not Somuch and dependent on anything. It independently exists on Netzach. U'Dvarcha Emes, and the Dvar Hashem is Kayim Lo'ad. Memele, that establishes Malchus Yisbarach in the Bria. This is the Marganisa that is printed in the Sefer Moritz Rabbeinu Me'alevi B'Shem the Biskirov. Kamadum, this Biskirov is not misparison.
I have it in Rav David's also.
Oh, okay. I guess I missed that part in the Yishon. I didn't see everything. It's hundreds
In the
of
new
pages.
one, in the new one. Book the new one.
On this one.
This one, coming one.
The coming. So Akaponim, this is American. Is it not yet misparison of Shlomo? I didn't miss it. I thought it was in the previous Madura of David. I thought I went through it.
No, it's
Akaponim,
now we know it's authentic.
It's a Marganisa the less Beitima, beer nifla of the Biskirov in the beer in Tefillah. Ki ato elikim emes udvarcha emes v'kayim la'ad. The fact that l'kayim b'chol rega v'rega becomes mikoyach the asora ma'amoros that the Rebbeinu Shalom was oimer, and Meila there's oimer ba'isa. Meila it's poshet that's a meshach shayche to Rosh Hashanah. The yom that the Ramchal says b'bechina sivuv hachodosh. The olam is choyzeh to the tchilas habriya of zayim tchilas masecha yom haras olam. Certainly on Rosh Hashanah, there's a chiddush of the Asar Ma'amoros, as Hashem speaks about in a number of places. There's a chiddush of the Asar Ma'amoros, and the Asar Ma'amoros are the siba why the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Kohen HaKoil. But Hu Adin, we also understand, because this is Nimshach in the Tfilas of the Yom Neroim, that b'chol rega v'rega, the Rebbeinu Shalom is the Kohen HaKoil Mikoyach. That dibur that was nischadish again in Rosh Hashanah is la'olam dvarcha mitzvah b'shamayim, and the mela that dibur is Mekayim the Bria b'chol rega v'rega, which establishes Malchus Yisbarach.